Your arm feels like it's part of you, right? You probably think that goes without saying. But what if I told you your arm isn't really part of you? It sounds weird to say that, but in a sense, it's true. Your arm is made up of trillions of cells, none of which are conscious or aware of itself or anything else. In fact, you aren't either. No one is. At least that's according to neuroscience. So then who or what are you? If your arm isn't you, and you aren't any single cell, then what makes you you? That question has puzzled philosophers for centuries, and now neuroscientists are starting to tackle it too. They finding that your identity is constructed by your brain, every moment from the activity of billions of neurons firing in very particular patterns. And that means you aren't fixed or static. Instead, your identity shifts and changes in response to how you interact with the world around you. In other words, who you are is partly constructed by the people around you, and that makes no sense at all. Welcome to my channel. First, let's get an even weirder idea out of the way. Your entire nervous system is constantly generating new neurons, especially in the hippocampus, which is important for memory. So although some of your individual neurons might hang around for decades, over your lifetime, almost all of them will be replaced. In fact, you could say no single neuron is ever conscious, because any one neuron can only be conscious for so long as it is not replaced. So if you aren't your neurons, then what are you? To answer that question, we need to consider what it means to be conscious in the first place. Most of us think of consciousness as a property of individuals. I'm conscious. You're conscious. This plant over here isn't conscious. But if you look closely, you can't actually find consciousness anywhere in the body. All you find are neurons and their connections. And yet somehow from that, something arises that seems utterly alien to the physical processes that generate it, namely subjective experience. How does subjective experience arise from objective physical processes? That is the mind-body problem, and it is one of the biggest unsolved problems in neuroscience and philosophy. But whatever the answer is, it doesn't seem to depend on any single neuron. So if you aren't your neurons, what about the patterns of activity among neurons? If neurons are just firing electrical signals randomly, then there's no way subjective experience could emerge from that. But the patterns of activity among neurons aren't random. They're highly organized. When you see this chair, your visual cortex is sending signals to other parts of your brain that integrate that visual input with information from your other senses and your past experiences. Those integrated signals are sent to even more brain regions until finally they reach the prefrontal cortex. There, the activity in your prefrontal cortex is compared to patterns of activity associated with other thoughts and memories. And depending on how similar or dissimilar those thoughts are, you become more or less convinced that you're seeing a chair. This complex, dynamic process gives rise to your experience of seeing a chair, including your experience of yourself seeing a chair. You experience yourself as the one perceiving the thing outside of you, the chair. And that too is an emergent property of the activity across a network of neurons. In other words, your experience of having an experience depends on your brain constructing an interpretation of what's going on. And that applies to all your experiences, including those that seem most fundamental to your identity. For example, when you think about yourself, a network of neurons in your default mode network becomes active. But when you think about other people, different networks become active. So your brain distinguishes between thoughts about you and thoughts about others. And it does it by creating different patterns of activity across distributed networks of neurons. That means there isn't any single place in your brain where your identity is stored. Instead, your identity is a pattern of activity across a vast, complex system. And since the brain always integrates new information with this overall pattern of activity, your identity is constantly shifting and changing. But all that still doesn't answer the question of what exactly constitutes your identity. You're clearly not just a pattern of activity in the brain. After all, different people can have the same pattern of brain activity, and they do all share the same identity. Otherwise, you wouldn't know that you were you and not someone else. That suggests that your identity is partly shaped by the unique way you perceive the world around you. But if that's the case, then the question becomes, how do you tell the difference between your experiences and those of others? Neuroscientists have found that although a lot of your brain processes thoughts about you and thoughts about others similarly, there are some key differences. For example, the superior temporal sulcus in your parietal lobe represents the way other people think about you. But in order for that region to figure out how other people think about you, it needs information about how other people are thinking about you. So it relies on information from the speech and facial expressions of others, and from your own theory of mind, which is your brain's model of how other brains work. Conversely, the medial prefrontal cortex represents how you think about yourself. This region gets inputs from other brain regions that encode basic information about you, such as your age and gender, as well as from regions that process your emotions and reward. To make things even more complicated, these two representations of you, the way other people think about you and the way you think about yourself, depend on each other. The way you think about yourself depends on how you think other people think about you, and the way other people think about you depends on how you think about yourself. So even though these two representations of you are processed in different networks, they also interact with each other constantly. In other words, your identity is undetermined simply by the way you think about yourself or the way others think about you. It's determined by both of those things together, by the interplay between your self-concept and your social concept. Now, unfortunately, researchers don't completely understand how all these different brain regions interact to construct your identity. It's a relatively new and rapidly developing area of research. But it is clear that your identity is constructed by your brain every moment from the activity of billions of neurons firing in very particular patterns. And that means you aren't fixed or static. Instead, your identity shifts and changes in response to how you interact with the world around you. But wait, if our identity is partially constructed by other people, then who are we? You might have come across some videos making the claim that free will is an illusion, because neuroscience has shown that every thought and action is caused by prior events, both in the brain and in the body and in the world. If everything is caused by what came before, then you can't be the agent of your own actions. You're just a puppet of causal chains. But that conclusion depends on the assumption that your identity is fixed and unchanging. But as we discussed, neuroscience says that's not true. You're not fixed. Your identity is constructed every moment by the activity of neurons firing in your brain. That means you're constantly free to become someone new. Indeed, that's what happens when you learn something new. By strengthening certain connections between neurons and weakening others, your brain becomes capable of thinking and acting in new ways. In that sense, you're always free to change who you are. You just need to change the way your brain works. And I explain exactly how that works in this video. Thanks for watching.